time to present my my scheme of low stress cycling. There's these different versions of, here's how you commute on a bike in places where it's sketchy or it's dangerous or it's rare or it's not encouraged, or crappy gaps between infrastructure, or bike lanes that don't really solve all the problems and have problems of their own and stuff like that. There's these differing kind of schools of thought of how to apply defensive driving to cycling, or how to get through normally and quickly, which I'm not going to try to do, because my whole scheme sacrifices commute time and dignity. It sacrifices commute time and dignity for a reduction in stress. So it's not like something that I do all the time. It's not something that it's for when you're not ready for the level of stress that your route demands, or you're not ready for the level of stress that you're seeing in other commuters and stuff. You're watching what other people are going through, and you're like, I'm not going to put myself in that position. This kind of offers you another alternative that is, kind of weird, but it works really well. And during the weird transition stage where in Toronto the roads are still going to be dangerous for cyclists for another 12 years, maybe 20, in a way that is dependent on what the cyclists are doing. So it's danger that a lot of the sort of people who've been commuting by bike in Toronto for a long time have figured out how to deal with. And so we're all kind of we've got to just share our schemes with the broader audience so that we can share our level of access with everybody else, and then we can get a boost in ridership, and then we can get more infrastructure, and the whole process of the roads becoming more safe can be accelerated, and the whole process can can involve less increases in driving congestion. So we don't have to. So we get bike lanes that are less empty. The weird spots between the bike lanes, between the bike routes, the gaps that we'll have to keep bridging are less dangerous. The rest of the road is less congested with cars. And yeah, that's what we want. So this is a strategy for this interim, for this time period, where it's going to be sketchy one way or another, and depending on whether you find some formula that works for you or not, you could be doing this sketchy time on your bike relatively safely, or in your car while you're watching, you're losing lanes to empty bike lanes, and it's annoying because you want to be cycling. So the premise of the thing is, it's too stressful to fight for your space on the road, and the actual dynamics of yielding aren't really covered by any of the sort of guides that are out there or anything like that. When the government puts together their driving instructions and their materials and stuff, it doesn't really take into account the fact that in order to comply with the law and and not detain faster moving traffic, cyclists don't just have to turn out as practicable. There's a huge gap between the expectation and the situation. So the expectation is, it's not a workable gap, and it's like nobody wants to talk about it because it's so shameful. Because in order to yield enough to satisfy drivers' needs, cyclists have to pull over and stop at least on any road where there's more than one full width lane going in each direction, and on many roads where it's just one lane. So there's all these situations, I'd say, everywhere where there's no bike lane, and intersections even when there are bike lanes, where in order to where the law grants cyclists the exemption so that we can go ahead and block traffic by doing things that drivers wouldn't get away with. That's the thing, is the law says you can't hold each other back on the roadway, but cyclists can, because we're not going to make them pull over and stop to let a bunch of cars by. We're going to let them turn out as is practicable, which means slow down and hang out in the right end of the lane and allow drivers to pass. And it works. That works a lot of the time. That's fine. Most of the time when I'm letting drivers pass me, I'm just slowing down a bit and pulling into an area where there's nobody, there just happens to be nobody parked there, or I'm using an intersection along a road where there's 4 lanes but 1 or 2 of them are being used for curbside parking or something like that, so where I have a gap. And this also contradicts the whole thing about cyclists riding in a straight, predictable line. The straight, predictable line thing has you not yielding in order to let traffic by when you're supposed to be. Or at least it conflicts with that in ways that I don't think have been adequately explained by any popular sources. Like in, here's how to bike in traffic 101. So I'm going to start with just outlining the actuality of how this works, because everything else is based on yielding. So to yield to faster traffic approaching from behind, you do have to weave in and out of you have to turn out of and then merge back into the lane that you're using as your main travel lane. This is exactly what you would be doing if you were driving along a road and going slower than everyone else for any reason. You're going half the speed of everyone else because you're looking for an address or you are something. That's what the curb lane's for. That's why drivers like having 4-lane roadways, because they've got a fast lane and a slow lane. But they also want to use the curb lane to pass each other and stuff like that, so it's complicated, and our being there interrupts their competition between each other for access to the next stoplight. They need it because over the course of the average Toronto driving commute, which is like 45 minutes, each stoplight could incur them up to a 1-minute time penalty, and so that could swing their commute time in either direction by at least 15 minutes. So they have to defend where they are from each other in order to not be up to 20 minutes late. So that's why they're so crazy, because They don't want to show up early half the time and then be hanging around, which is what they should be doing, which is what all of us should just do, is just give ourselves more time and not have to compete. Since that's not going to happen, we got to recognize that they have a competitive situation going on, which is precipitated by the shape of the roads and the character of enforcement. So that's why cycle tracks and protected and separated infrastructure is so popular, because where driving speeds are above a certain threshold, it's necessary because these two commuting modes are incompatible and they can't share space. In the we've already been given the keys to a better, brighter commuting future for everybody in the shared space philosophy, which has been implemented in a few places in Europe and the UK, of course. And that's the scheme that has actually delivered us immediate, happy drivers. They put it in, everybody's freaking out. People are threatening to move away, and immediately they have shorter drive times, and collisions go down to zero, pedestrian fatalities go down to zero, and they have all these stories of just people being like, I can't believe this worked, this is great, we're all nicer to each other at work now because we don't have these road rage incidents, and we're not waiting at the light anymore, and blah, 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 blah. And none of it involved special cycling infrastructure. And none of it involved cutting up the roads and any of that. But that scheme is so radical that in order to introduce it to me, in order to make me understand it, took a 1 hour long presentation by this British traffic planner to, maybe it was a half hour and it took me 2 times watching it or whatever. But it takes like an hour of video just to make you think, wow, how could that possibly work? And then another hour of like commentary to understand, oh, okay, I get it now. So it's like a 2 hour explanation. It's way too radical for Toronto City Hall or the Public Works and Infra Committee or the Traffic Department. So we're going to go through this stage of this complete streets thing, which we're doing now, which leads to really, really super angry drivers. Because it's taking space away from them and then not making it as safe and effective as it needs to be to attract popular cycling popularity to it. And it's taking so long, it's like it's going to be underperforming for a long time. And then we'll get all these untouched streets that are super popular cyclist corridors where, you know, when cyclists have critical mass, it becomes really awesome and safe, and then every other time of day, it's just a death trap. So, the whole practice of yielding to faster moving traffic coming from behind is, I think, just critical to cyclists using the road during this interim. And it can be accomplished, and basically it's fine. It's not a big deal. It's just you have to be willing to either have mirrors on a helmet, because mirrors on handlebars are just too jumpy. It's just they vibrate around too much. You can't see anything. So you either have to have a helmet with mirrors so you can see behind you. You have to see behind you. You have to maintain awareness of what's behind you. You have to proactively and aggressively and preemptively yield. Yeah, that's what it is. You have to preemptively yield to the drivers that you're otherwise going to come into contact with or inconvenience or whatever. And then you have to whatever else. So the thing is, like, the network by and large is almost good. So you just need to learn this stuff for the spots that you can't avoid and that you can't go through just biking normally, just like commuting normal. So, of course, the first step before this is you map around you figure out a map that gives you a longer commute that's going to be maybe faster and definitely less stressful. So you're already compromising yourself. It's a very compromised strategy for people who are like, well, I'm not up for this and I don't want to stop cycling. I need something to make this available to me when I'm not ready to do battle. So it's not, it hasn't come up because nobody wants to admit I'd rather just walk through this intersection as a pedestrian with my bike next to me than try to prove that I can do it on my bike, or to try to say, well, if that's the way I'm going to be, then I shouldn't be on the road or whatever. I'm too wimpy. So the willingness to keep track of what's behind you and actually yield from in front of somebody. The willingness to yield by stopping, which you're not required to do by law, but the willingness to do it when you have drivers on your tail, just to get them in front of you instead of behind you. You have convenient opportunities to proactively take all the drivers that are behind you, most of whom are completely chill, but maybe 1 in 20 or 1 in 100, 1 per commute, 1 per week, something like that, are ready to instigate a road rage incident. You just want to get all those drivers. If they're going faster than you, you want to just shift them so that they're in front of you, and then they disappear into the distance, and for a certain amount of time, you have no pressure on your tail whatsoever. And you're just doing things normally. Instead of the typical experience, which is just continually being passed, and every single pass being like, oh, I wonder what will happen with this one. Oh, that one was good, that one was good, that one was good, that one, what was that guy doing? He doesn't care about my safety, and getting into this whole thing about it, when really it's just like, it's so few drivers, but when you have a whole crap load of drivers passing you every day, or stuck behind you for 15 to 30 seconds at a time, when you know that you're not slowing them down overall, but they don't necessarily know that, however I was going to end that sentence, I'm just going to say it's really so nice to be able to just shift all those people to in front of you if they're going to end up there anyway. Even if you're going to end up filtering back in next to them at the next light, which is going to happen all the time. And then the other thing is you have to be willing to get off your bike and walk with your bike on the sidewalk through sketchy spots for like maybe 200 meters at a time at the most, or 100 meters at a time or something like that, because there's all these intersections along bike routes where the streets between the intersections are pretty safe, pretty protected, pretty fast. They're great. And then the intersections themselves are unchanged and just ridiculous. So where you're approaching the intersection, the bike lane is full of right-turning drivers who, well, it's a mix of people who are there to turn right and people who are there to pretend that they're going to turn right so that they can pass the left turning and even through traffic while they're in the middle of the intersection. So they're spamming the bike lane all the way back to maybe the 50-meter mark, wherever the dashed line starts. You've got at least, if you've got like 3 cars in front of you in the bike lane, you know you're going to miss the signal anyway. When it gets to the point where it's faster to just get off your bike, walk through the intersection as a pedestrian, cut off those same drivers as a pedestrian, when you know that they wouldn't be willing to yield to you. Like if you're going through there, this is the magic bullet. It's hilarious. If you're going through there on their right, on your bike, they will try to put pressure on you. But magically, if you get off your bike and walk through the crosswalk as a pedestrian, they will yield to you. They'll yield more to you. They'll feel more pressure to yield to you. Because they see the bike lane as changing into the right turn lane where they have magical priority, and their turn signal is supposed to force us to yield. It doesn't. I mean, if you're approaching an intersection where somebody's hanging out there with their right turn signal on, you have no obligation to yield to them. You can just go on through. But they expect that you have that obligation. They've been conditioned to expect that if they have their right blinker on, anybody that they hit while turning right who had the chance to slow down and yield to them, like if you had the chance to yield and you didn't, then they don't feel responsible for a collision if you smash into them while they're turning right. So there's all these little interactions where the mechanics of yielding are completely out the window. So basically in any stressful, sketchy spot, just take advantage of your ability as a cyclist to become a pedestrian who has a bike with them. It's a wonderful privilege. It's something that I would love to have been able to do as a driver, just pack my car up into a backpack or whatever and walk it along the sidewalk through some spot that was terrible for driving. That would have been awesome. And then the problem with that, of course, is a lot of people do not want to take that dignity hit where they're getting off their bike. In the middle of their cycling commute, they're getting off their bike and they're not managing to make it through the intersection at a decent clip. And that's just, it's not okay with them. It's not okay with me either, but I do it anyway. Because to me, I'm protesting it by remaining there and by refusing to shy away from using the road and using the sidewalk when I have to, and risking like spamming the sidewalk with my presence where I'm standing there with my bike waiting, and maybe 5 other cyclists are doing the same and trying to stay out of the way. But when you've got 5 cyclists waiting to walk their bikes through the crosswalk and then get back into the damn bike lane on the other side because right turning drivers coming from behind them, left turning drivers coming from in front of them, and then right turning drivers coming from their right are 3 sources of danger that they have to deal with within a 5-second time period. And have a very bad record when it comes to yielding. It's just it's a ridiculous failure to yield generator. It generates failure to yield behaviors among drivers. It could be enforced on, but it's not. It's exactly what they do to each other, so let's not assume that it's about cyclist hatred. They're just like, oh, you're in our racetrack? Okay, come and race with us. Come and play our game with us. You want to swim with the sharks? I mean, look what Rob Ford said. You're swimming with the sharks, and if they get injured, it's their own fault at the end of the day. That's the attitude. It's like, fine, join us. Go ahead and ride your little go-kart as part of our NASCAR experience. In spots where there's good bike lanes, you can basically just worry about moderating your speed in the lanes so that you're ready to yield to somebody that enters them in front of you. So you just moderate your speed according to how much extra room you have to work with. That's not super hard. That's all right. It's using really stupid intersections in pedestrian mode. And then it's also transitioning from where there's lanes and stuff to where there's nothing. There's all these roads that don't have bike lanes and are still alright for cycling on. But the transition between the safe stuff and the weird stuff is sketchy. So you have to be aware of these transition spots and figure out your own way of going through them. You have to be careful about when you're going to try to make a normal left turn and when you're going to try to make an indirect turn. And when you're going to just make a left turn as a pedestrian. I don't really have good instructions for getting through left turns. There's all these spots where you have to like hang out and kind of stay out of the way while you wait for another light so that you can avoid making a normal left turn, because basically the same reasons that going through an intersection just normally is often really sketchy, because you need some people to yield to you who have a good likelihood of not being willing to or really sucking at it. So turning left is it's nice to know how to make an indirect left turn, which is you just cross like you're going straight, and then you get in whatever position you'd want to be in if you'd been coming from that direction that you're ending up on, like the direction that you're trying to get onto with this left turn. After just crossing straight through in the direction that you're going, when you start going through the intersection, you just find wherever you'd want to be if you'd been coming from the way that you're intending on going to. So you just like bike across, basically get off your bike, get on the sidewalk, walk in the opposite direction from where you're going to go next, which is where you're going, where you're making a left turn. Get behind a couple of drivers who are sort of where you would want to be if you're going straight through. Just get to wherever you want to be when the light turns green on the direction that you're destined to go, and then go from there. So you end up taking longer and whatever. The other thing that people do is just get to the other side of the road that they're on, so like cut across, and then this is basically just cutting through the left turn. And you can do this by just if you're coming up to a red light, you can just bike up to the crosswalk, get off your bike, step into the crosswalk, cross the crosswalk as a pedestrian, and then when the light turns green to get onto, the crosswalk will take you into your destination spot on your destination road. And then you just walk across, get on the left side of that crosswalk, mount your bike up, and then get going. That's like that's the two most stress-free ways to get through an intersection that you know is going to be sketchy. Half the time you don't have to do any of this stuff because the traffic volumes aren't that insane. But when they are insane, you need to still be able to get through some of these spots. The really hard spots to deal with are big, long stretches of 4 or 6 or 7 lane arterials where there's no way to avoid it, there's no way to map around these spots. And the best you can do with your side street mapping is get to the point where you only have to do this for like maybe a half a kilometer at a time. But if you have to, if the taking the lane situation is not working for you on the curb lane, on the very wide curb lane of a lot of these Toronto arterials, then you have to figure something else out. And to me, taking the lane and any kind of lane control, any kind of anything that I do to try to restrict the speed of motorized traffic coming from behind me, in a place where the speed limit and the design speed of the road are far in excess of what I'm capable of, under those conditions, I find that any of that kind of lane control precipitates road rage incidents. And scary driving. I guess the last time I tried taking the lane on Scarlet, I just had somebody... I was checking behind me really frequently. I was checking behind me as frequently as I could without taking my eyes off the road in front of me too much. And I was going as fast as I could. So I was like, okay, I'm doing 30, I should be good. So I'm checking behind me every few seconds. But a few seconds is all it takes for traffic on Scarlet, which is a 60 or 70 kilometer an hour road, to catch up to you and start tailgating your ass from a half a meter behind. Okay, it was like probably like 2 meters. But when I'm at 30 and this other guy just shows up out of nowhere, along with like 10 other cars in the space of 2 seconds, 3 seconds, from being an empty road behind me to suddenly I have like a stampede on my tail. Even if that never led to an accident, it's just too scary. Partially because when you're behind a cyclist, you have to have enough space to be able to stop in time if that person just suddenly stops moving. If the cyclist in front of you just falls off their bike or something, if their frame just cracks underneath them, then you need to be able to not run them over when you're braking. And you need to not have somebody so close behind you that they're going to run into you when you hit the brakes. So drivers aren't doing that. They're not giving themselves enough space to be able to stop quickly enough to not hit you and not get hit from behind when you have to slow down or something like that, or stop really suddenly. And you could have to stop really suddenly at any time. So every road that you use, you have to be like, okay, I have to be able to stop really suddenly if I'm next to the curb. The closer you are to the edge, the slower you have to go. And so this whole strategy of keeping cyclists next to the side of the road and keeping us slow when we really could just be doing 25 and 30 kilometers an hour in the curb lane, which is this frickin' slow lane anyway, if they just let us do it and stop putting pressure on us from our left and from our rear, that would be awesome. But that's not going to happen. The lanes are, actually so wide that taking them is from the middle is annoying. They're super wide. They're wide enough to share if you're going 30 and they're going 35 to pass you. But you can't go 30 on the edge of them. You have to go 20 at the best. You have to be able to bob around to avoid all the crap that's there. So you have to... It's not reasonable to use that road in the way that the handbooks and stuff suggest without bumping up against this issue of yielding to faster moving traffic from behind. So on these roads, my best bet when I have to use them and I have to be on them is traffic surfing. It sucks. Traffic surfing is where you do what I was doing, which is you pay a ton of attention to what's behind you, and you get out of the way of the pulses, the waves of drivers coming through. So they come through in stampedes, and then the road is pretty much chill between these waves. So it's like, why have each wave go through you when you could just get out of the way of each one, and then between them you can more confidently take the lane and go fast because you know you're monitoring what's behind you. You know you're doing what you need to do in order to simply not be passed because you're paying enough attention behind you that as soon as somebody gets close enough to you from behind, that I don't know, that when they get to when you've got a bunch of when you've got a new wave coming behind you, that's when you pull over and just hang out on the side of the road, which is super convenient in one of these wide lanes because you're just hanging out on the edge of this really wide lane with your two wheels and one of your feet taking up half a foot that is untouched by drivers anyway, and you're completely chill and you're just pretending to like check your phone or something like that, or you're checking your phone. We all want to check our phones every 30 seconds anyway. You might as well simply do it every time you're waiting for a rush of traffic to pass. And then between the rushes of traffic, you have this kind of quietness behind you, which lets you tell pretty easily when somebody's approaching, because you hear basically nothing, and then you hear 4 or 5 drivers in the next rush, and then you're like, oh yeah, they're coming, and you pull over. You're like, yeah, there they go. All right, there's, just like being at a race. You're 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and then there's nobody behind you because all of these extra lanes are completely unnecessary anyway, well, for the most part, because all it allows them to do is compete and jostle for space between the intersections, which is why they're always taking up all the lanes, even when traffic volumes are low. So you can just take advantage of this by just surfing the traffic. You just keep going until the drivers are catching up with you. Pull over, stand around for 30 seconds till they're all in front of you. And then maybe there's like one straggler that made a right turn down there and totally has space to pass by you anyway. Because that's most of the time on these roads. If you really just look at them normally, even during rush hour. Like I hang out next to Jane at rush hour and check out Jane. And Jane just goes from being empty to being full to being kind of a third full. So it goes from being just desolate, and that's when all the pedestrians cross it mid-block, to being full of cars for 10 seconds, and that's what keeps cyclists off of it, because for a cyclist who's just staying on the road, that's every 30 seconds or every minute or whatever the duration of the surrounding distant traffic lights are. And then there's the times in between where there's more than enough room for everybody that's there. There's no conflict between drivers and cyclists because there's a clear slow lane and a clear fast lane, and it's all good. So since it's only really these brief periods on these arterials in any given chunk where you can't really, there's no way to safely bike on them, and you're getting passed at high speed. Since that's just part of this pulse, you can just become part of the rhythm and just sort of deke out of the way. And you have to like not see it as being demeaning to you. It's your way of doing what you're legally required to do as a cyclist, which is to yield to faster moving traffic that is coming from behind. Safely. And of course, the law is the combination of the law and the shape of the roads is unreasonable because it means either you have to do unsafe stuff as a cyclist or piss off drivers. So it just, the law and the shape of the road doesn't work. So that's why this tip is not going to be in a cyclist's handbook, because you shouldn't have to do it. In terms of your rights and stuff like that, you shouldn't have to do it, and you don't have to do it. But it's basically what you have to do in order to just use these roads normally, because you can't use them normally. So you have to adapt them to suit you, or you to suit them, or whatever. So it's, you map your way around crappy bits. I'm going to make a better video about Google Maps mapping. You walk your way through the crappy bits that remain in your optimized route. You yield in you yield proactively in order to deny drivers the opportunity to scare the living shit out of you, and you advocate for better conditions so that your commute doesn't have to be as ridiculous as it is, and you don't have to do as much like advocating for nicer drivers, because you don't need them as much. You don't need them to see what you're doing. You don't need them to be able to predict what you're doing. You're not relying on them for your safety. So your cycling advocacy efforts can shift from, I need drivers to stop doing this and that and whatever, or I need cyclists to start taking the lane so that drivers can learn how to do something. You can shift from that to a standpoint that's more, I need to be able to just use a normal commute and go fast and not have to do these crazy detours in order to have safety. Because then we're at a point of lots and lots and lots of cyclists who are safely conducting commutes that look kind of ridiculous. And there's tons and tons and tons of cyclists doing it, to the point where half the time you get critical mass and you don't have to do sketchy stuff anymore because you're taking up the whole curb lane anyway, as happens on many of our arterials during evening rush during the summers. But I think it would be a lot better to be advocating from a standpoint of we're inconveniencing ourselves like crazy for no advantage to drivers. Let's just fix this, instead of I'm putting myself at so much risk to do this. I mean, of course it takes both, but Toronto cyclists feel like they're expected to be martyrs. Like, they're expected to go use this unsafe network, and our deaths will lead to change. And that's annoying. So I'd rather do I'm cool with looking like a convenience martyr, where I'm like, I do not care. I'll pad my commute time by 5 or 10 minutes because it's still faster than the TTC. It's still more civilized and more convenient than driving, and it's still better than walking. So since the result is the best commute that it could possibly be anyway, I do not really care about sacrificing 10 seconds to save 5 drivers 30 seconds each on some road that was not designed to accommodate us together. And I'm cool with walking through an intersection that would be slower by bike and sketchier by bike, especially when half the time I make it through faster than the drivers that were failing to yield. So that's the other aspect of it. It's kind of like you have to have compassion for everybody else, because like as an ex-driver, I know their experience is crappy. They're forced into this motorsport, like they're forced into a commuting experience that's been turned into a competitive motorsport, and they hate it, and they're losing space that ends up getting underused, and they're seeing the crazy stuff that cyclists are doing because we're improvising around ridiculous situations, and they either understand it or they don't, but one way or the other, it's just such a crappy experience for them. And it's a crappy experience for them when there's no cyclists around too, and when there's no bike lanes around too. It just sucks being a driver. And because I know that, I'm like, of course I'll pull over for 5 seconds to shift the person that's behind me to in front of me. Of course I will. I don't care. I mean, I do care. I care about their 30 seconds more than I care about my 5 seconds, because it's 30 seconds instead of 5. And especially if it's like 5 people and it's 30 seconds of each of their time, and 10 seconds of mine or 30 seconds of mine. Part of the law is you have to cooperate to a certain extent. Don't do selfish stuff in traffic where you're forcing other people to yield to save time for yourself when you're costing them more time than you're saving to yourself. The overall commute time collectively doesn't need to be added to. It needs to be subtracted from. So everybody needs to be looking for opportunities to kill 5 seconds of their own time to save somebody else 20. And that's the arterial roads and stuff completely kill that whole tendency. That's the natural tendency of like drivers and everybody and cyclists and whatever, is you're like, oh, I can save that person 5 seconds. All right, do this, go. At no problem for you. Drivers can't just do that, so they don't get to show their true colors on these arterials. They're bullying each other, and they're trying to stay out of the way of the bullies amongst the other drivers. And so being able to safely yield to cyclists is like a important thing for drivers, but it's hard. And that's why when you get to experience roads that don't provoke that kind of competitiveness in the drivers, then you get to see what they're actually normally like, where they're being cooperative as well, and they're yielding to you to save you time. They're yielding to you to save you from having to stop at a stop sign, to save you energy. They're yielding to you because they don't really know what you're going to do and they don't care, and it's fine. So this is something that a lot of Toronto cyclists haven't experienced. They don't know that side of the drivers here. They don't know that that's drivers, just generally. That's normal drivers. Because their experience of drivers is in these spots where the roads just bring out the worst in everybody. So I guess I'm going to try to make a better mapping video, and I'm going to try to make we can try to continue working on the like side street routes map that I've been working on, because it's a fun project, and hopefully that can be useful to some other people, or at least maybe the idea for the form of notation that it takes would be useful. Like, this is kind of my lighting situation sucks, but these are all street names, these little squiggles there, and I'm trying to figure out some. This is a way of route mapping that has actually worked for me, because cell phones aren't good at giving you good. Like, it's hard to improvise a good bike route on a cell phone, and that's what you have when you're getting around. So I find I have to use the desktop version of Google Maps with all of its features, or do that on my phone and actually sit around on the side of the road and like pick a route, but a lot of those features are missing from the mobile versions and stuff. So I've ended up, I'm feeling fenced in, so I'm making this big route map of the whole city, piece by piece, and this is one piece of it. And I've got this massive Google drawing, which is a combination of a whole bunch of these maps. But maybe that'll be useful as well. But it's like, if this works, I feel like this could work for a whole bunch of people and kind of solve a couple problems and make this a lot easier. It's because it's just so much easier than it seems, and it's so much easier if you figure out some scheme for dealing with the hard aspects of it. And there's these different schemes put forward by different, like, experienced avid cyclists like myself, and they contradict, and they're offensive to different people, they're effective for different people. So I'm putting my own dog in the ring. I'm putting my 2 cents in terms of, here's another option. I'm going to call it stress-free cycling, or I don't know, whatever. I'm going to call it hopefully something that we only have to do for a couple of decades, or maybe just one, and hopefully in a reduced amount of locations. See you out there on the road.